The real history of the goblin is not a single origin story but a tangled, shadowy evolution that stretches across centuries of fear, superstition, and cultural imagination. Rooted deeply in the folklore of medieval Europe where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were dangerously thin, and where every unexplained sound in the night, every missing object, every sudden illness, and every whisper in the dark was often attributed to unseen entities lurking just beyond human perception. The word goblin itself is believed to derive from the Old French term gobelin, which may be linked to a mischievous spirit haunting the town of Evreux in the 12th century. And some scholars connect it further back to the Germanic word kobold, a term used to describe household spirits or underground tricksters in regions like Germany, indicating that the goblin was never a single creature but rather a category of beings that evolved differently depending on region, culture, and fear. In early medieval belief systems, goblins were often described as small, grotesque humanoids with twisted limbs, sharp teeth, and glowing eyes, creatures that thrived in darkness and decay, inhabiting caves, forests, abandoned ruins, and even the hidden corners of human homes, where they would emerge at night to cause chaos, stealing food, tangling hair, breaking tools, or whispering madness into sleeping minds. Unlike demons associated with organized religion, goblins were more primal and chaotic, representing the unpredictable dangers of the natural world rather than a structured evil. And this distinction is important because it shows how goblins were deeply tied to the everyday fears of common people rather than theological doctrine. During the Middle Ages, especially between the 12th and 15th centuries, belief in goblins spread rapidly through oral storytelling, particularly in rural communities where literacy was rare and stories were passed down through generations as warnings disguised as entertainment, often told around fires or in dimly lit cottages where the atmosphere itself seemed to breathe life into the tales. And in these stories, goblins were rarely harmless pranksters as they are sometimes portrayed today, but were instead malicious, unpredictable, and often dangerous, capable of leading travelers astray in dense forests, luring children into darkness, or even replacing human infants with changelings, an idea closely linked with other folklore. Creatures like fairies, but often attributed to goblin-like beings in certain regions of England and Scotland. The connection between goblins and underground spaces also reveals another layer of historical context, particularly in mining communities across Central Europe where miners believed in kobolds, goblin-like spirits that inhabited tunnels and mines, sometimes helping miners by guiding them to rich veins of, or but more often causing cave-ins, extinguishing lanterns, or leading them into deadly traps, reflecting the very real dangers of mining life at the time. And interestingly, the element cobalt is named after these spirits because miners blamed kobolds when ores failed to yield valuable metals. As Europe moved into the Renaissance period, goblins began to appear more frequently in written literature, evolving from purely oral legends into characters within stories and plays, most notably in the works of William Shakespeare, where goblin-like creatures and mischievous spirits appeared in plays such as A Midsummer Night's Dream, blending elements of fairy folklore with darker, more chaotic traits, though Shakespeare's interpretation softened their image slightly, making them more whimsical than terrifying, yet still unpredictable. However, outside of literature, belief in goblins remained strong among the lower classes, particularly in isolated villages where superstition continued to dominate daily life, and it was not uncommon for strange events, such as livestock deaths, missing tools, or unexplained illnesses, to be blamed on goblins, leading to protective rituals like leaving out offerings of food or milk to appease them, or placing iron objects near doorways to ward them off, reflecting a widespread belief that goblins could be both appeased and repelled depending on human actions. During the 17th and 18th centuries, as the Age of Enlightenment began to challenge traditional beliefs and promote scientific reasoning, the idea of goblins started to shift from being perceived as real entities to symbolic or fictional ones, though this transition was slow and uneven, especially in rural areas where folklore persisted long after urban centers began to dismiss such beliefs. And even as skepticism grew, goblins did not disappear but instead adapted, becoming part of emerging literary genres such as Gothic horror, where they were reimagined as embodiments of fear, darkness, and the unknown, often appearing alongside other supernatural beings like ghosts and witches. By the 19th century, with the rise of Romanticism and a renewed interest in folklore and mythology, scholars and writers began to collect and document traditional stories about goblins and similar creatures, preserving them in written form. And one of the most influential figures in this movement was Jacob Grimm and his brother Wilhelm Grimm, whose collection of fairy tales included many references to goblin-like beings, though often under different names, highlighting the diversity of these creatures across cultures. During this period, goblins also began to take on more defined characteristics in art and literature, often depicted as small, hunched creatures with exaggerated features, green or gray skin, and a penchant for mischief and cruelty, an image that would later influence modern portrayals in fantasy media. In the 20th century, goblins underwent another transformation as they became integrated into popular culture, particularly through fantasy literature and games, where they were often portrayed as a race of creatures with their own societies, hierarchies, and cultures, sometimes as enemies and sometimes as comic relief, a shift largely influenced by authors like J.R. Tolkien, who used goblins interchangeably with orcs in some contexts, in his works such as The Hobbit, depicting them as cruel subterranean creatures with a structured society, which added a new layer of depth to their portrayal but also distanced them from their original folkloric roots. Despite these modern reinterpretations, the core essence of goblins remains tied to their historical origins as embodiments of fear, chaos, and the unknown. Creatures born from the human need to explain the unexplainable, and to give form to the darkness lurking just beyond the edge of understanding. And even today, traces of these ancient beliefs persist in rural folklore, horror stories, and cultural traditions around the world, reminding us that the goblin is not just a creature of fiction but a reflection of humanity's deepest fears and its enduring fascination with the unseen forces that may still linger in the shadows, waiting, watching, and perhaps even whispering in the dark.